Alright, welcome to part 2 of the underwater tutorial. And the first thing we're going to do is we're going to make some rocks and put them in the screen. Now, you've seen me make rocks before, and I'm going to show you now my file that's got some rocks in it. This is one of my assets files, and if you remember from the lakeside tutorial, I created some rocks basically by shattering an icosphere, and this is what was created. Now what I've done is I've actually changed the material on these rocks, and I'll just show you exactly what I've done. So what I've done is I've made the base colour a slightly greenish, sort of browny muddy colour, and specular slightly white, and on the texture side I've put a marble texture on, and that influences the colour a tiny bit, makes it a very, very dark brown, and it also influences the normal quite a lot. Then what I've done is I've added in another texture, which is basically, it's a noise texture, and that just affects the normal, and that gives the whole thing a kind of a gritty appearance. And finally I've added a gradient texture to put some green on the top of the rock, just on the top, and that's to simulate obviously algal growth on the top of the rock. So if I render this group of rocks that I've created, you can see what that looks like, and as you can see there's some little bits of green, and the actual rock itself is quite sort of crusty looking, which is what I wanted. It kind of matches the inside of the cave that we created in the last tutorial. And now what I want to do is I want to make some different types of rock, and the first type of rock I'm going to make is a rounded rock. As you can see, here it is, and if I just align the camera to that to the view, I'll render it. As you can see, you've got a similar thing, and what I've done is exactly the same process so that the rock looks similar, but this texture doesn't cover anywhere near as much of the rock. Now obviously you can change that if you want to. If you want more green, then all you need to do is to come into the texture settings here, into the colours, and adjust the brightness and the contrast, and I'll show you what that does. If I take the brightness up, basically it adds more green. So if I render that now, you can see I've got a bit more green on the top, and I'll leave it at that. I mean, but you can also adjust the contrast, and what that will do is that will change how far down the rock the green comes, and it will also make this a more pronounced transition or a less pronounced transition. But you can see that it's a similar sort of set of shapes, but a somewhat different colour. I've made this a lot lighter than the other rock, whereas this rock here is a lot browner. And the way that I've done that really is, once again, it's with the textures. Here I've reduced the amount of colour that adds in, and so that's created this kind of greyer looking rock, and this is like a sea-worn version of these rocks. And I'm going to create a few more of these now so you can see how I do it. So I'll just hide that, And the reason I've produced these in this file is so that I can import them, and so that you don't have to spend hours watching me create loads and loads of rocks, which is pretty damn boring really. Now I'll show you one other thing I've done. As you can see, if I move this rock, it changes completely as you move it. And this is a feature I quite often use when I'm creating things like rocks that don't move in the scene. Obviously if it was animated and moving, then this would be rather off-putting as it kind of acts like an amoeba as it goes across the screen. But I find this very useful because it means that when you're using particle systems to spread rocks around the place, every rock will look different, even if it's picked the same rock from a group. So that rock now looks totally different from the rock before, and if I move it again, you can see it's a different shape again. So how do I do that? Well, the way I make rounded rocks is, funnily enough, I start with a sphere, and I'm going to start with an icosphere. So let's add in an icosphere. First of all, I'll move this rock out of the way. Let's move this rock out of the way a bit. Go back to camera view for a second. Right, add mesh icosphere. It's a regular icosphere with only the two divisions that you can see. You can have more if you wish. I often find it a waste of time. Now that previous rock that I had was a flattened rock. Okay, it was flattened, and the way that I did that is, before I did anything else, I scaled it like that. Okay, now this rock I want to be totally different, so let me just turn on the keys so you can see what I'm doing. So I'm going to do Control Z, which will undo what I just did, and this rock I want to be kind of a long, narrow rock. It's still, you know, it still wants to be a little bit flat, but it's long and narrow. So it'll produce a different range of shapes from this one, and that rock over there is something else I'm going to show you in a minute. So ignore that one for the moment, and we'll just work on this one. Right, so the next thing that you want to do is you want to add in a modifier, and the modifier that we're going to add is displace, which is there, and you can use a texture that you've already got or make a new texture. I'm going to make a new texture for this one because I want a slightly different effect, so otherwise the rocks will all tend to look a bit samey. So the texture I'm going to use, I'm going to add it, and if I go over here to textures, it knows that what I want to do is a displace type texture, and I don't want to blend. What I want is a Voronoi, which produces these little cells like this, and this produces, normally it produces quite jagged sort of shapes. So if I come back in here, I'll move this around now. Whoops, what's going wrong? Something's going wrong. There's probably not enough vertices actually. No, what it is, I need to remember to set the coordinates to global. So there you go. So that's what happens to your icosphere as you move it, when it's just a plain icosphere. But now I'm going to add another modifier, which is subdivision surface, which will smooth it all off. I'll just make sure the view is the same as the render, which is set to 2, and you can see that there we go. It's behaving exactly as the other one did, except I want to set the shading to smooth. So there you go, you move it, it totally changes. I mean, it keeps the same general shape, but it will look different. So that's another smooth rock, so I want to give that the same material as this rock over here because it's the same type of rock. So I'm going to go into materials, and I've got two materials at the moment in here, sharp rock and smooth rocks. I'm going to select that smooth rocks and I'm going to render it just to check what it looks like. There you are. It's now a long thin smooth rock. And I'm going to create a couple more types of rock. Shall I let you watch me do that? No point really. I'm going to create a couple of more smooth rocks and I'll show you what I've done in a moment. And here you can see in one view, you can see all of the rocks that I've created in this smooth rock type. Here you have the original one that I showed you, the long one that I did while you were watching. Here I've got an even more flattened version of that. It's much flatter, which produces some interesting effects, as I'll show you. I also made this using an icosphere with more vertices. This one had a subdivision level of 3, and this one here is one that's more rounded, more 3D, and it changes shape a lot more than the others because it's got fewer vertices in it. This was an icosphere with a subdivision level of 1. So let's show you what I mean by that. Here we go. Oops. Get it right. So you can see this changes shape massively because there's very few vertices in it. So the texture has a stronger effect. Whereas this one has much more vertices in it. So you can see it's flat. And it still changes, but because it's got a lot of vertices, it tends to keep the same shape more, and just surface details change. So that's this type. So if I view top, and I'll put them all in a sensible position, off to one side someplace. Like so. And those are all we need because they morph themselves. These rocks will look quite different from each other even if they're all in the same scene, especially if you have lots of different scales. Now the next thing I want to do is I want to make these rocks into a group, so I'll select them all. So there's all 4 of those rocks that I've created selected, and hit Ctrl G, and that creates a new group from all of these, and we can go down here and rename that group to smooth rocks, and then that lets us import it into a file and we know what the heck we're doing. So let's have a look at this other beastie here. What was I doing? Yeah. So you can see once again it's the same looking type of rock at the moment because I've used that same smooth rocks type. But in actual fact I'm not going to leave it as that. I'm going to give this one a different material because this is bedrock. This is supposed to be like a slab of limestone bedrock, so I want to change it to a limestone type texture with maybe some fossils in it, which I think would be quite interesting. So let's go and find one of those, and if I maybe type in limestone with fossils, texture. We'll see what we got. And we want it large, as we always do with, and we don't want this sort of thing with fish in it, which is a bit of overkill. That sort of thing with the shells in, that's quite good. It's just a question of looking around until you find something that you really like. Now I used to live in the Isle of Wight, which is down off the south coast of England, and one of the things you get on the Isle of Wight is a lot of limestone, especially in an area called Bembridge, and it's that sort of limestone with lots of shells and fossils in fact just like that. Although it says textures of New York, that is exactly, in fact I wouldn't mind betting that that is actually a slab of Bembridge limestone that's been cut. I'm going to use that because I rather like that. So I'm going to save image as, and let's put it in my 3D folder, because I'm planning to use that possibly all over the place now I've got it. Limestone fossils. So there we go. So let's go and change this material. Now before we change it, we need to make this material, make this object use its own set of materials and not that one that we had before. And the way we do that is if we go in here, make single user, materials and textures. So now it makes a copy of that previous material, and it's now called Smooth Rocks 01, and I'm going to change that to Bedrock. And what that's done for us is it's copied all the settings, because I'm only going to change one of these textures. I'm not going to change all of them. I just want this to look like bedrock and to have it blend in with all the other rocks. So which texture do we change? And the answer is this one here. That's the one that we change. So I'm going to get rid of that from there. New texture, image or movie, and we're going to go to our 3D directory, or rather my 3D directory, because you possibly don't have one, and it's limestone fossils, that one, and it looks like that, and we want to make it a cube. After all, this is actually a cube really anyway, so that we're like so. And we don't want to influence the colour by 1, we want to shade that down a bit so we've got some control over the final colour using the actual material. And I'm going to make it affect the geometry, not by that much though, maybe by that much, and let's see what it looks like. So you can now see the difference. You can now see that what we've got is actually looking like a slab of limestone. Now what's wrong with it at the moment is that the values here are rather too much. So we want to knock this back a bit. Maybe to there. And the specular intensity, I'm not sure if that wants to come up for limestone. Let's have a look and see what it's like. Maybe somewhere in the middle. So there we go. And that's just one type of rock. Now I'm going to create another one and show you how I created this, because I want more than one shape of bedrock. And the way I created this is quite simply from a subdivided cube. So let's put that somewhere we can see it, and we'll add our cube like so. Now before I subdivide it, I'm going to change the shape of it because I want this to be kind of, it's still going to be flat, but I want it to be kind of a wedge shape. So I'm going to take it down like that. I'm going to go into edit mode. I'm going to pick edge select by clicking down here. I'm going to select an edge. I'm going to move that edge like so. I'm going to select that edge. I'm going to move that edge like so. And what might be fun is to give it a little bit of a slope as well on the top. So I'm going to move that edge like that. And I'm going to hit A to select all the vertices, having gone to vertex select first. And I'm going to subdivide it once, twice. Twice is probably enough because it's a fairly small, although actually does it really want to be that small? It wants to be around about the same size as the other bit. So if I go to top view, how big was the other rock? Quite a bit bigger than that, so I'm going to move it around a bit, and I'm going to subdivide it one more time just for luck. And you don't want to subdivide things too much if you can possibly avoid it, but you need enough vertices for the modifiers to work, so there's a bit of a trade-off there. So let's move this across a bit. Oops, maybe not quite that far. And we will add in our modifiers as before. First of all, a displace modifier with a global texture, and I'm going to use one of the textures I've already got, which is kind of a rocky texture. As you can see, that's like way too much. So I'm going to take that down to maybe something like that, because I know that all these jaggedy edges are going to start disappearing as soon as I put the subsurface modifier on. So I have the subdivision modifier. So there you go, and there you've got, now you've got kind of a wedge shaped version of the other rock. Mustn't forget to set it to smooth shading and apply the material bedrock. So there you go. Now, as well as that, and these aren't going to be placed incidentally by using these aren't going to be placed by using a particle system. These particular rocks, these are going to be placed by hand. They're possibly going to be quite large as well, some of them. And I just want to create one more rock, which is going to be in the bedrock series as well, but it's going to be square and kind of, well, you'll see in a second, because I won't bother pausing it because it's not going to take very long. So first thing to do is to add in our cube. And this particular one is actually going to be roughly a cube shape, so I'm going to keep some of this cube shape but not all of it, because what I want to do is I want to make it slightly irregular, which I'm going to do by just modifying individual corners before I go and do anything about subdividing it. So we'll edit that, and I'm going to modify it by putting that corner in and the opposite corner in that way. I mean, this might seem a bit weird, but what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to make it so that whatever angle you look at it from, so long as it's a different angle, it looks different and it's not quite a cube. It's very nearly, but there aren't actually any faces that are perfect squares, because a perfect square is just going to look wrong. It's just going to look so weird if it was a perfect square, and this corner here obviously at the moment is too square, and I'm going to go the opposite way to that, to the way you might think. So that's going to be basically that. I'm going to make it slightly flat and large by going back into object mode and scaling it up along the two directions there. So it's a bit flat, not hugely flat. And once again we'll A to select all, a couple of times, deselect then select, and we'll subdivide 2, 3, that's fine. And we'll go in, we'll add a modifier, and you've seen this before. But a lot of doing this sort of thing in Blender is pretty repetitive. You have to kind of remember that, and we can't see what we're doing either with modifiers until we go into object mode. And suddenly bang, we've got this kind of amoeba shape. And now what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to apply the subdivision surface now. Well, I'm not going to apply it, I'm going to put it on there. And the reason I'm going to do that, let's change that to global, is that I want to be careful that I don't lose a lot of this waving around. So now with that on, I'm now going to play with the strength, because I want this to be fairly uneven, but not so uneven that it looks really crazy. And that's pretty uneven. So what does that look like then when we move it about? I'll set it to smooth shading, and we'll move it about a bit and see. And we can see actually that's not quite strong enough. Or maybe we should change the mid-level a bit. What do you think? Pinch it in a bit, make it more pinched than it is. Actually that's quite good. I think that's how we'll leave it. I like that. So the final thing to do is to go in, well, nearly the final thing to do, go in and put the material for bedrock that we made on there, and we'll just quickly render it, see what it looks like. Oops, and we're off the frame. Just view camera. Very badly off the frame actually. I just want a rough idea of what it looks like. I'm not, we'll move these out of the way. Something like that, hey. And there you go. And as you can see, by varying the scale and playing around, all these rocks are going to look very different, as you will see very shortly. Right, we'll show hide that, and the final thing to do is to put these in a group to make them easy to import. So we'll just select all of them, same as we did before, Control G, and this time it's bedrock. And you can check what group things are in if you go into the little box there, and you can see we've got bedrock rocks, we've got smooth rocks, we've got sharp rocks, and that for this scene is all that we need in the way of rocks. So I won't bore you anymore with that. Now the next thing we also need is we need seaweed. So I'm going to save this, and I did a bit of experimenting, because the way that I did the weed the last time I did this is simply by making some hair and colouring it green and making it wide at the bottom and thin at the top and using some wind. Now that was okay, but it was a bit boring, and we'll have some of that type of weed in the scene as well. But I did a test just recently, and this is the file I did to test. And if I go to view camera, this is just a plane with lots of weeds on it, and all the weeds are is they're just planes that are cut out and put at 2 different angles like that. And then I use my old friend the cloth simulator, because when you blow wind on it, cloth changes as well, and if you get the settings right, it works quite well. So here's the animation that came out of that. So if we do a more detailed version of that plant and apply the same sort of settings, then it should move around in quite a realistic way and be a lot more complicated than just kind of bootlace type weed. So that's what we're going to do. So the next thing to do is simply to go into a new file. So now I'm going to make some seaweed, and we'll start a new file. And what I'm going to have in this scene eventually, I'm going to have 3 types of seaweed. I'm going to have one similar to the one that you've already seen in the preview, and I'm going to have one that's kind of a branched version of that with a stem at the bottom, and I'm going to have one that's got leaves on it. So let's go ahead and we'll do the simplest one first. So if I get rid of this cube, press X, I might as well turn on the screencast keys again. So now you can see what I'm doing. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a cylinder. Now down here you can set the vertices, that's how many strips there are that go around the cylinder, and it's quite important for this one that you can set the vertices either to 12 or 15 depending on how many strips of seaweed you want. I'm going to have 4, so I'm going to set it to 12. And let's scale it about. So this is going to be the stem eventually, or before I do that I ought to really delete the top face. So select faces down here, select just the top face, X, and we want to delete the face. The bottom face I'm going to leave because it'll help impart some rigidity into the bottom of the cylinder. Because what we're going to do eventually, we're going to use the cloth simulator to make it wave around. So let's go back to object mode and finish scaling this. So I'm going to just hit the S key and I'm going to scale it down. Then I'm going to use the handle, I'm going to make it taller. I'm going to hit the S key again, scale it down a bit more. Hit the handle, make it a bit taller. And that is all I need to do at the moment. I'm just going to hit view selected, and now you can see at the top here we've got a number of edges. So we're going to go into edit mode, and I'm going to select 2 edges and then skip one, and I'm going to do that all the way around. So if I go into edge select by clicking here, so I'm just going to select 2 edges, hit the shift key, miss one, select 2 edges, miss one, select 2 edges, whoops, not that edge, miss one, select 2 edges, and there we go. And this is going to form our 4 leaves. I'm going to hit E for extrude and hit escape, so it centers it again, and I'm going to go up, And what I forgot to do, I forgot to scale this bit down, because we want the top of the stem to be narrower. So click here so that we can select everything, even stuff that's behind it. So that's illuminated now, which means we can do that. A, to deselect the edges that we've selected, select vertex. C, to give us a circle, we'll select that, hit escape, and then I'm going to scale it down, down, like so. We wind up with this nice goblet shape. Very good. Right, that's exactly what we want. And from here we're going to extrude out all these leaves. So we're going to go back into edge select again. I'm going to reselect all these top pieces here. I'm just going to keep extruding these and scaling them. Whoops. I'm just going to keep extruding and scaling just those top edges. Just make sure I have only got the top edges selected. No, there's one that's snuck in there. I'm having trouble because I've left this switched on down here, so I'll turn that off. Right. Let's deselect the edges I didn't want selected. So right, now we've only got the top edges selected. That's better. All goes to show, if you miss the sequence out, you screw things up. So, E for extrude, hit escape. And the reason I'm hitting escape is we don't want it just extruded in any old direction, we want it extruded in the direction we want it. And S for scale. As you can see, that's pulled that out quite nicely. And the next one I'm not going to actually scale. I'm just going to hit extrude. And this is going to be the long leaves of this plant. E again. And the reason I'm doing several extrusions is that the cloth simulator wants a few vertices to work with, otherwise it doesn't look very good. And in fact I'm going to subdivide this in a minute. So you can see we've got this nice long leaf sections here. Escape, sorry. And then I'm going to finish off the top of the leaves, and the way that I'm going to do that is by selecting the middle vertices on each leaf. So we'll go back to vertex selection, hit A to deselect, and if I view selected on that, that should give us a good view. A bit too close up maybe. So shift and click all the others. So we've just got the middle vertex selected, and I'm going to move those up. So we're going to have pointed leaves, like so. And that all looks very good to me. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to subdivide these to give us some more vertices to work on. In order to do that, I'm going to turn that back on. Going to do a box select with B, because I don't want to subdivide the bottom, because that wants to be quite stiff, whereas these bits here want to be quite floppy. And we'll come down, we'll subdivide. I'm going to actually subdivide it twice. So there, so you've got quite a few vertices in there, and that should be enough for the cloth simulator to get a handle on and produce some quite nice wavy leaves. So that's that as far as it goes. So that's the weed. Now we're not finished yet. As well as a material, we also need to animate it and make it wave around. And these weeds are going to be placed in a very specific manner so that they indicate water flow. So the first thing I want to do, I actually want to make sure the origin is at the bottom, because that makes things easier to move around. So I'm going to select one of the bottom vertices, it doesn't matter which one, and I'm going to snap the cursor to that selected vertex. As you can see, the red and white cursor has appeared down there. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into object mode and transform origin to 3D cursor. So now the origin is down there, and when we move it around we know that that's the bottom of our weed. It won't be the center of it, but it's pretty close. We don't really worry about that. So how do we make it move? We make it move with wind. So I also need to add a force field, and I'm going to have to copy this exact force field into our scene later, because we want the bootlace type weeds to react in the same way. So wind, and of course it's put it in down there, which is where we don't want it. I want to scale it up because it wants to have an effect on the whole weed. I mean, eventually this weed's going to be scaled down. It's a bit enormous at the moment, but it's good so that we can see what we're doing, and that's what we want to do at the moment. So I'm going to lift it up. I'm going to make sure it's actually pointed at our weed, which it is, and now we need to look at the physics panel, and you can see here we've got a puny little strength. I'm going to set it actually I'm going to set it using the graph functions, but I'm going to put 9 in there for the moment. A flow of maybe about 5. No noise, because we're going to put noise in a different way. Okay, and everything else can stay just as it is. Perhaps, hang on a minute, yeah, everything else can stay just as it is. So the next thing to do is to go into the graph editor. Oops, no, we want to hover the cursor over there, over the strength, press the I key, so we set a keyframe, and instantly you see here we've got a field strength appearing. Now I'm kind of guessing here, and I might have to alter this in a minute, but I reckon our field strength is going to have to be quite a lot higher than that at its peak. Now I'm going to hit N, which brings up this function bar here, and I'm going to add a modifier. The modifier I'm going to add, I'm actually going to add 2. The first one is built-in function, and it's the sine, and the amplitude I'm going to make as about 13. Phase multiplier controls how fast it goes, and if I set that low, whoops, I wanted 0.1 not 1, you can see the lower it goes, the slower the wave changes. Now at the moment it's changing direction about once every 2 seconds roughly. Yeah, about once every 2 seconds it changes direction, and that might be fast enough or it might be too slow. We don't know yet until we actually have a look at the animation. But having done this before, I can tell you that that is in fact a little bit too fast, and I'm going to set it to 0.85. Sorry, 0.85, 0.085. That's better. And now we're going to give it some value offset, because we want most of its effect to be positive. So it's going to spend most of its time in one direction, but occasionally it's going to reverse. And what that gives us is some waviness in the action of the weed. And then I'm going to add some noise. So I'm going to add another modifier, noise. And if we come down here, we'll see that that is the scaling in time of our noise. I'll just open this up so we can see it a bit more. That's the strength or the amplitude of the noise, and I'm going to turn that up to maybe the same sort of thing as the sine is, about 13. And the scale in time, we can play around until we get something we like. Now the confusing thing is this scale goes the other way. The higher it is, the slower it is, whereas the sine is the other way round. So we want to put maybe something like that in, and this makes sure that it's never quite the same. Okay, and that is good enough, and you can see that that actually goes on forever, so it doesn't matter how long we make our animation, and the animation is going to be a bit long. And some of the reason for this, no, I shall use a different method. I'll get rid of the pre-roll thing, because very often with cloth simulations what you want is you want 25 frames for it to kind of settle down before you start the animation. But there's another way of doing it. What you can do is you can take it to a point where you like it, stop it, make it real, and then do the cloth simulation again. And that's the way I'll do this, because it's a bit easier. So how long is our animation going to be is what we need to decide, sort of thing. Now I'm going to make it 400 frames. Okay, and that's going to take quite a while to render eventually in the final scene, but hey, we might decide it to be different, but all we're going to get out of this particular file is the weed and its animation, so we don't need to worry overly much about that now. So there we go, and now we can select our weed, and in the physics panel, which is this one over here with like the bouncing ball, got the cloth, we can turn that on, and we want to drop the spring right down to maybe 0.3 or 0.4, somewhere like that. Air damping, I mean, I know it's underwater and water damps quite a lot, but you'll find that the actual structural stiffness is going to damp it, which I'm going to take down to around the 3 mark. And bending, whoops, 0.1, and that means that it'll bend on quite a tight radius when it bends. So that's what we've got so far. Now we do actually want to pin it, and what pinning does is it lets areas be unaffected by the cloth simulation, so that the vertices that you pin actually stay put, they stay where they are. So in order to add those, we're going to go into edit mode again, and I want these vertices here at the base of this kind of goblet shape, and the vertices at the bottom I want to be pinned. So I'm going to make sure that's on, which it is, and that we're in vertex select mode. I'm going to hit the C key, so I'm going to have all of those and those, and we're going to have to make them a group. And if you go to mesh, vertices, vertex groups, assign to new group, and they're now made into a new group. Now to see that new group, if you go over to the right hand side here and object data, and you'll see vertex groups, there's a group and it's called group, and I'm going to double click that and just call it pinned. Okay, so I remember what the heck it is. So now I'm going to go back into the physics, back into object mode, pinning I'm going to turn on, and the vertex group is pinned. So that's that. The next thing is cloth field weights. We want negative gravity because weeds actually float, the root is anchored, the weed actually floats, and the negative gravity will let it do that, but we don't want too much negative gravity, so something like minus 0.05 will be plenty, I believe. And we may have to play around with the wind strength. So now what we can do is we can turn on our animation and we can see what happens. And what's happened already is it hasn't gone very far. So yeah, you can see it's kind of half-heartedly waving around, and that's no good to me. I want more action from my weed than that. So let's also go into cloth cache. We're going to set the end of it as 400, which is something I forgot to do, which is why it stopped moving. So in order to make the wind more effective, I'm going to turn up the effect down here, wind effect. Gonna see what 5 looks like. Whoop. 5 looks like. So that'll have 5 times the effect that we've just seen, I hope. So hit play, and you see instantly it's very, very different. Now at the moment the negative side of it's not having much effect, and that's because of the position. And you can see it's kind of streaming, which is quite good. You can see what I meant about pre-roll, because it looks rather silly at the beginning there where it's stuck up straight, so we need to get rid of that whole beginning part there. But before we do that, we need to refine our wind. Just go up there, click on field. We need to refine our wind because it needs to come more negative than it actually is. So the value offset wants to come down to maybe around about 4. We'll try that. Back to 3D view. That's kind of better. You can see it starts to move back. What I don't want is I don't want it moving all the way there and all the way back. We could maybe do with it being better than that, so I'm going to take the value offset down a bit further, maybe around 2.5-ish. Let me see what that looks like. It might be good to drop this down, move it to the right a bit. So there you go, you can see that now it's kind of more convincing that you've got weed moving in the current. And actually I think that this should bend as well, so I might remove those pins at the top of there and we'll see how that works. So let's just stop this for a minute, select our weed, go into edit mode. Now this is how you remove stuff from your vertex group. So I'm going to hit A to deselect everything. and I'm going to just select using circle select, just make it smaller, that there, hit escape to get rid of the circle and remove, and to check that I can hit A again to deselect, and I can always get to select everything that's called pinned, and as you can see it's only these vertices here. So now if we go back into object mode, this shaft here should bend as well. I don't know how much, it might be too much, we'll see. And there you go, shaft is bending as well. Is it bending too much? No, I don't think so. I think that's pretty good actually. In fact, I think I need to stop that about there. Right, now I'm going to show you what I mean about avoiding the need for any sort of pre-roll. I'm going to take this as being sort of an ideal shape for the weed for it to start. Okay. You could choose somewhere else, you could have it wherever the heck you like, but I'm going to take it, this is a good place to start from. And so what I do is I go into the modifiers, and you'll see there's a cloth modifier there, and I can apply it, and what that does is it makes the weed that shape and it leaves it that shape. And now what I can do is I can go back in, I could re-add the cloth modifier because obviously it's taken it out. I can change the settings to about what we had before. That was around 4, I think. That was 0.1. Pre-roll was nothing. Pinning, pinned, and we want a 400 frame end to the cache. Gravity minus 0.05, and wind was 5. Right, so now our new animation, which actually will be the final animation for this weed, looks like this. But it wouldn't be very good if we had just had that one type of weed doing that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to duplicate this and then change the duplicate a bit, not a huge amount, just a bit. In general, when you're doing things like this, it's best to have 3 different types. So if I hit duplicate there, hit escape, move it along. The reason I'm moving it along is because they're different, these will actually have different actions. Hit duplicate, escape, I'll move this one to be the other side. Right, so, and they will have inherited all of the things that we've added on, including the cloth simulator, but we haven't baked it yet, so they won't all eventually be the same. So the first thing I'm going to do with this one is I'm going to rotate it a little bit. And then I'm going to go into edit mode, and I'm going to take one of these, perhaps more actually, because they're easy to get hold of. So I'm going to actually select the end vertices of all of these and hit escape. I'm going to extrude them, and and I'm going to extrude them again, and I'm going to extrude them again, so that we've got two that are very, very long. And that's my modification for that one. And the idea is we'll have lots of different shaped weeds. Well, not lots, only 3, but it'll look like lots, I promise you. The human mind isn't very good at counting, you see. It's a terrible thing to say, but it's very true. So, the next thing I'm going to do, I'm going to rotate this one slightly, but I'm going to rotate it the opposite direction, like so. And I'm going to rotate it away like that, so it's more kind of upright. And what shall I do with this one? I could take these two and make them very short, couldn't I? So if I object mode, edit, C, I can make them short, and I can make them long or thin or whatever the heck I want, really. Let's scale them in one direction and see what happens. So you've now got some quite lumpy bits at the end of there, and I'm going to scale it down, and that effectively has shortened them. So if I now go into object mode, and somehow I've managed to catch that as well, which isn't very good. Let's Control Z, not Shift Z, Control Z. Let's go back into solid. Right, where was I? Control Z. That's better. Right, what I should have done, I went into edit mode, because I had those were obviously selected from before. I should have hit A first. So, my fault. Deselected. Zoom out a bit, and we will select all of this lot. Hit escape. Scale them out in one direction. Scale them in the other direction. S for scale back down again. So we've got some strangely shaped bits at the end of these leaves. And maybe we'll actually move as well. We'll do something like that, so that these plants look all entirely different, really. Okay, and obviously you can do whatever you want. So because we've got the cloth simulators in there, we can actually have a look and see what these do. So if I we should be able to. Why aren't the others working? Something I have done wrong somewhere. I know this works because I've done it before. Wind set to 5, yes. End set to 400. What about here? End set to 400. And this is our original one, which obviously has got the end set to 400. Oh, I know why. Because we didn't start at 0. A lot of these things in Blender, if you don't start at 0, it doesn't pick up on. That's better. I don't think there's actually enough difference, is there, between that one and that one. There's enough difference here. So maybe I ought to take one of these others and make it long. Perhaps. Or shorten the body. That was another thing I could do. Just stop it there. Go into edit mode. So you can see as soon as I go into edit mode, the cloth simulator, because it's not baked or anything, has, the effects of that has gone. Right, hit that there, still got that selected, which I have. Hit escape. Oh, A to deselect everything first, which is what I forgot to do the last time. That there, escape. Go down, 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 down. And across, and down, and across, and escape, and we'll go back into object mode, go back to the beginning, and start again. So what I want to see is these weeds all doing somewhat different things, and as you can see, now they are. This one's staying relatively closed. This one's a bit more open. Now what's going to happen with this one if I increase the power that the wind has? Let's say I'll make that 7. I need to go back to the beginning again to see what that does. That's a bit better. And if we had a whole field of those all waving around, it would all look quite convincing. So I'm going to leave those there, just like that, and I'm going to apply material. And I'm going to cheat because I'm going to use the material that I had before, and I'll show you now how to import materials from another file. So if you've got material you really like, you can use it, and I'll show you what the settings are on that material. This just saves a bit of time. So we can go down, we can append, and this is 3D assets actually. No, it's not, it's in underwater because I haven't moved it yet. And it's there, and we want materials, and this is actually material layer 1 because I haven't actually done anything with it yet. I haven't renamed it, and so this weed here, I'll make it material layer 1. I'm going to rename the material as a weed. Actually, I'm going to make it weed 1 because I suspect materials for the others I'm going to be changing, and I might actually change this one. And exactly the same here. Oops. Who didn't hit the return when they renamed it? Me. And this one here, weed 1. What I actually want to do is I want to make these knobbles here, I want to make them stand out more, because a lot of these weeds, they actually have air bubbles built into them. It's just a natural thing that's done to keep it afloat, and at the moment I've got clouds on there, which is fine, but I'm going to change that to hard, and I'm going to change the brightness of it. As you can see, you're getting more of a lumpy effect there, which is what we want. Something like that. And I think that's actually enough. Size of them can probably come up like so, and I'm going to turn this effect up here. Right, so you can see basically what I've got is I've got a diffuse colour and a specular colour that are both green. One's a lot lighter than the other. Intensity is quite high, hardness of 50, which is the standard anyway, and translucency around about the 0.8 mark, which means that light will actually come through it when it's lit from behind, which some of this weed is going to be. So if I now get the lamp, which is in there somewhere, as I say, this is actually a very big weed at the moment, but we'll scale it. So I'll change that to a sun, make it slightly yellow, give it an energy around about maybe 5, and we'll tilt it so that light is going to shine on our weed in roughly the same direction as it will do in the final scene. Something like that. And let me see, where am I? View front? No. View left. That's better. I think we were on view right. There we go. Something like that. Yeah. So view right. And we'll align the camera to the scene so we can do a trial render. And there we go, we'll just quickly render that, and you can see what this looks like with those lumps on, and you can see where it's not translucent, it's quite dark, which is what we want. Where it is translucent, it's quite light, which is really quite good. If I want to increase the size of those, so if we go back, actually I'll change their names as well. So if I hit that one, probably the easiest way to change names. Weed 1A, Weed 1B, and Weed 1C. Okay, now we're going to change this material, and what I'm going to change, I'm going to change the scale of this quite a bit actually. Something like that. I'm going to drop. In actual fact, I'm not sure I like that. Maybe that needs to go the other way. Maybe our scale needs to go smaller. Yeah, it does. That's better. That's more like it. And normal. And we'll make it affect the translucency as well and see what that does. Yeah, That looks pretty good. So that's our first group of weeds. Now before we can actually use those, we need to bake the cloth simulation on those. So one by one, go and hit bake. As you can see, it's going to run through it, and then we'll move to the next one and do the same, and the next one and do the same. And I'm just going to do that, and I'll put it on pause while it's doing that, because it's going to take some time. Right, done that. Now all I need to do is select all three of them, scale them down and make a group out of them. So if I hit shift and right click all the other two, preferably without the sun, and scale it down. Oh, what am I doing? Ah, I've got that activated. Scale it down. Oh, I know what's happened. I should have scaled it down before I baked it. How typical. Because Blender stores all the vertices, I can't now apply a scale. So let me just go away and sort that one out. So this has been rather a long tutorial so far, and all we're doing is seaweed, so I'm going to try and make the next part of it a bit quicker, the next type of weed. So I've got the three weeds that we've created, and I've selected all of them, and I'm going to add them all into a new group by hitting Ctrl G. The group's going to be called Weed 2. And as we can see, they're now all in that group, Weed 2. Okay, so if I move them out of the way, just view top, and I'll select all of them. Easier to do that from, oh, you can't multiple select up there. Right, so we'll move these weeds out of the way, and that leaves our staging area available to produce some more. Right, now this next weed is going to be a branch type of weed, and I'm just going to start that by adding in a grid. I'm going to leave the grid precisely as it is for the moment. I'm going to turn it through 90. When I said leave it precisely as it is, what I meant was that it's still going to be 10 by 10. Okay, just for the moment. Eventually it's going to end up a bit bigger. Actually, I'm going to make it 11 in that direction. As you can see, we've gone back, no rotation, so I'll need to put those back in again. And the reason for that is to get a branch in the centre, and you'll see what I mean in a second. So if I go into edit mode, we can see that the grid is just like that, and I want to go into face select. There's face select, A to deselect everything, C to get a circle select, And what I'm going to do, it didn't come out with 11, what the hell. Doesn't matter. What I'm going to do is just kind of draw the rough shape of a fan-shaped weed on here, just to get rid of the bottom vertices, like that. Don't want it too symmetrical. Get rid of that one as well. And so that's X. Oops, escape to get rid of the circle select. X. No, I wanted to get rid of faces. Control Z. X. This time get rid of faces. There we go. That's better. A to select all. And we're going to subdivide. Like so. And now we'll zoom in a little bit. And let's put in a little bit more detail. A to deselect everything, C for circle select. We'll get rid of the nasty square lumps first. Whoops. And we'll draw in the next level of detail, and the next level of detail. Kind of like that. I just want kind of this irregular kind of fan shape going on. And that will do for there. And I'm going to hit escape to get out of circle, X, delete faces. As you can see, we've got this sort of kind of shape going on, and it's never going to look, when you do it this way, it's never going to look particularly good to start with, but when it's moving, it suddenly looks a heck of a lot better. I think that's the key to it. It's like knowing that when it moves it's going to look different. Otherwise you could spend, you know, hours on doing this. Literally hours. Well, I have spent hours on doing this, as you know. This tutorial is pretty damn long. It's just a question of making it not very regular. So there we go, and that's the basis. And when I say basis, I mean because we're going to add some bits to it. Okay, and here's how we're going to do it. I'm going to select edge select, so I'm selecting that edge, E to extend. So I'm going to bring it up, going to bring it over, going to rotate it. E to extend again, bring it up, rotate it. E to extend again, and that will do for that one. And then we're going to do the same here. Same here. and so on. And I'm going to do that all the way around, and I don't really think you need to watch that, so I'm going to pause. Right, so as you can see, what I've done is I've continued adding those bits around this one, which was the original one. I've copied it over here, and basically I've changed the shape of it. And now what I'm going to do is a similar sort of thing to what we do with low poly trees. I'm going to add this object at 90 degrees to that one, or vice versa. It doesn't really matter which way around you do it. So the first thing I'm going to do is move it across so that it stands on top of it, like so. And then I'm just going to edit the rotation so that it's at 90 degrees in its position, so it's in the center, and you see that what you've got is one of those things. And now what we do is we shift click the other object and we hit join, and they both become one object, like so. Now we don't want it to look like that from the camera point of view, obviously, so I'm going to rotate the whole thing. Whoops, hang on a minute. Rotate the whole thing 45 degrees. Then I'm going to go down here, I'm going to apply rotation and scale. And applying the rotation is quite important when you use the cloth simulator, otherwise it can get all confused. View front, make sure we got it. There we go. View camera. Now we've still got our wind in there. So our wind should be coming from the right direction and doing everything that it was with the other weed. So the first thing we need to do is change the origin of this object. So if I go back to edit mode, I'm going to go into vertex select mode and select one of these vertices at the bottom for the origin and snap the cursor to it. Go back into object mode, transform origin to 3D cursor. So there we go. So now we're into the cloth simulator phase of this. And structural bending down to maybe 2 or 3. Air damping, drop that down. And the cache, it should be at 400, which it isn't. Always defaults to 250. I wish they'd make it default to whatever the actual setting was at the time. And gravity minus 0.04 or something like that. And we had the wind setting the last time of 5. So let's have a look and see what that's going to do. So you can see it's blown the whole thing away. Now why is that? It's because we haven't got any pinning. So we need to pin those bottom vertices, which I forgot to do. So we're going to edit mode. Zoom right in, turn on selection limits, and I'm going to pin the first 2 layers of it like that. And what I could do is pin the top as well to make it bend differently, but I'm not going to. So we're going to escape, go into mesh, vertices, vertex groups, assign to new group, go in, change the name of it. You don't have to do that, but I find it helpful to change it to something like pin or pins, because sometimes you can have multiple vertex groups on a single object. And we'll go back into object mode, cloth simulator, pinning and pins. View camera, and let's have another look, and that's better. Turn the shading to smooth. And you can see that's quite convincing. Now it looks a bit jaggy at the moment, so let's try something. Let's see what it's like with a subsurface modifier on it. Subdivision surface rather, I keep calling it subsurface. And there we go. That's much better. And I'm not going to have many of these weeds, and they're going to be in the foreground, so I'm not going to bother to, they're going to be placed manually, so I'm not going to bother to do anything else with that really, apart from give it a material and bake the settings. So let's just bake those cloth settings. I need to change the name of it to Weed 2. Excuse the cup of coffee, but it's quite early in the morning here before going to work. That's to say my real work. And so we'll change the name of it from Grid to Weed. I don't know, the other one was Weed 1, Weed 2, that'll do. What the hell? I know, we called the group Weed 2, didn't we? Weed 3. Doesn't really matter, it's just for my own purposes of thinking about it that I want to rename it. You can rename it anything you like as long as it's not the same name as something else. Right, so we want a new material, and I'm going to start off with that Weed 1 as a basis. Okay. And mainly because of the texture, and if I do that, in order to be able to change it, what I need to do is to make it single user. So I'll go up here, single user, materials and texture, selected objects, and now you can see it's put Weed 101. I'm going to call it Weed 3, what the heck. I'm going to change the colour of it, and some of these seaweeds are more of a sort of browny colour. They're like a reddish brown, like that sort of colour. And obviously the specular intensity wants to be around that way as well. So like that, and hopefully we've still got some translucency. I'm going to make it more translucent because it's a darker colour. What happens if I render that? You can see what we've got there. In fact, I think that's too translucent, so I'm going to turn that down. I think that specular colour is too bright, so that's going to come down. And this is too bright as well, so that's going to come down. Let's render it again. That's kind of more like it. Now you'll notice I've got green bits in there. That is possibly something to do with the texture, because I let it affect the colour. Yep. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to still let it affect the colour, but I'm going to make it go like a dark red, like that, instead of green. So look again, that's a bit better. You've got these kind of reddy flashes. That's fine. So that's all the weeds done. Okay, I'm going to save this into my assets directory, as seaweed.blend, so I can use it on lots of other things. Now we can go back to our tutorial. There we are, and we can think about placing rocks and weeds, and that's going to be in the very next tutorial. It's going to be placing the rocks, placing the weeds, and putting the water in. My apologies for not putting the water in this time, but this tutorial is long enough already. Thanks very much.